So here's a recap of our stuff today, Thursday, October 14th. We started in on learning targets and just talked about we should have these two pretty much on lock after getting them reviewed and taking the quiz yesterday. And then we added in a couple key vocab words down here. So in your reading, you heard a lot about this nucleosynthesis. This is just a fancy word for fusion. So we put in our definition of fusion here. You can go ahead and pause and write it in. But it's this process of elements combining with the pressure and the gravity around them and then making these new, both heavier elements and also releasing energy out. So again, pause, make sure you get that definition in. A lot of people asked me yesterday about this word, isotope, so I wanted to make sure we covered it today. It's just a version of an element. So when you were playing the game, deuteron was really common in our game. It's a version of hydrogen that has different numbers of neutrons. So we did a quick recap of these particles, proton, neutron, and electron, and that'll come up later too. The third one that we defined is spectra. And spectra is what we were looking at as the fingerprint of the stars. The last couple days, we were using that fingerprint to determine what the star was made of, its composition. So its definition is this picture. So we described it as bands of color showing energy emitted by something giving off light. So elements are stars. So go ahead and pause. Make sure you get these three definitions in at the bottom of your learning targets. And it'll be a couple days before we look back at any more new learning targets because we're getting information from our explains that we've been talking about. So we were trying to get this one, explain number 1, ready for today. So you should have had these 5 questions ready to go. And we just did a quick summary here of what we read about, starting with just doing a little labeling on this diagram. So we labeled up those couple particles in the atom that we were talking about because this is a great visual of fusion. So fusion, we said, is elements combining together. And here we have 2 isotopes of hydrogen. So we know they're hydrogen because they're just one proton. So we labeled these blue ones with a P for proton. And these gray ones are the neutrons. So we labeled that one with an N. And the third particle, the electron, is so teeny tiny we don't see it. But if we would in this diagram, it's rolling around the outside. The main ones for mass are proton and neutron, so that's why they're in the diagram. So we know these particles exist out there in the universe, and gravity is what's pulling them together. So we're kind of just making a visual of that definition we just recorded. So we have 2 particles combining because of gravity. That is the process of fusion. And they combine to make 2 outputs. One output is a brand new, heavier element. And we can see it's a new element because the name is different, has different number of protons. And we also know it's heavier because we see 2 particles, 3 particles. Combination gives us the element now with 4 particles. So as elements fuse, we get new, heavier elements, and we also get a release of energy. That's why we have that outward arrow, and we get a lot of it. So that's our process of fusion. And in the reading, we were introduced to the idea of Big Bang nucleosynthesis, or fusion during the Big Bang, really the initiation or the origin of all the elements that exist here today. So you had some key questions that I asked you to answer. What we're going to do is write in a quick 3 bullet points to kind of summarize big picture that reading. So you're going to record your information here. And again, it's just going to be 3 bullet points. So here's your first one. All elements that exist today initiated from the Big Bang. We already have a pretty good idea of what the Big Bang is, right? It's the beginning of the universe, 14 billion years ago. Matter was all compact into this teeny tiny point, and it expanded outward to create what we have today. And in that initial expansion, we started having particles appear, right? Protons and neutrons started to exist. And in this Big Bang nucleosynthesis, these particles started to combine and make the very first elements. So that was one of your questions that you had. What are the first 3 elements that formed? And those 3 elements are really the building block for all elements that exist today. And when we hear that statement, we should just let it sink in a little bit. All elements that exist today initiated from that Big Bang. So if you look around wherever you're sitting, everything around you is made up of atoms of different elements. Everything that exists today around you, including yourself, is initiated from those very beginning particles from the Big Bang. Pretty cool. So our first couple particles, hydrogen, helium, and lithium, are the ones that still are the most abundant today in the universe. So why those 3? What about those 3 that made them the most, or the first elements? Here's your bullet point number 2. Bullet point number 2. These initial elements came first because they're the smallest or the simplest composition. In that first picture that we labeled 2 versions of hydrogen, one that was simply 2 particles and one that was 3. So as all those little particles started to form in the Big Bang and come together, just simply 2 particles or 3 particles were needed to create that very first element. And when you think back to the game, those elements kept showing up every time you swiped. Hydrogen kept appearing with every new swipe or every new gravity because they're just tiny particles. Gravity has ease pulling them together. So second bullet point, initial elements are the initial elements because they're the simplest composition. We don't need a lot of matter to form them. As we think back to the game and combining those hydrogens, that was pretty easy. And like we know with nucleosynthesis, every time they combine, we get something more massive. And so those 3 particles starting created everything that we have now. So another question you had in the reading was, where are those other particles forming? These particles are forming just in the universe, but then where do we have enough gravity to start combining these to get the bigger elements that we have now and make up the whole periodic table? And that's your third and final bullet point, is more massive elements form later within the core of a massive star. So we can see in our picture here, hydrogen combines to helium. That's pretty simple. But then we keep building to these more massive elements, eventually getting to iron, which was what we were trying for in the game. And again, the more gravity that's pulling them together, the bigger those elements can become. And so that's why we see the bigger elements forming in bigger stars. So that's your third and final bullet point. So just a summary of the big ideas coming from that explained section number 1, and then you have a few of those details answered in the questions. So be sure that those are submitted. The last thing that we looked at today was our quiz review. So we all opened up our quiz. We recorded our initial quiz score right here. It was out of 5. And remember, what you're doing here is recording correct or incorrect. If you have a correct question, all you need to do then is come right over here give a fact or a quick summary about that question to help lock it into your brain. Lock it into your brain moving forward, but also lock it into your brain if you're doing the retake, which is happening tomorrow. If you have an incorrect question, then you're looking here to make sure you know where to find information to help you put in notes and details to get you to the right answer. And I know if you're not here today, you don't have this form, so I'm putting it into our Schoology page. Right here in our stars and elements, I'm putting it in our assessments folder, so you can put it into Notability and have it digitally since you don't have the piece of paper with you today. And this is also where you can find the quiz from yesterday too. So open it up, look through your questions, right? Go split screen and say, okay, question 1, I got it right. Star it up, give yourself a quick fact, a summary, a key idea from that to help it stick in your brain because we need it moving forward. If you have an incorrect, circle it up, figure out where you should look, and then give those details to get you to that right spot tomorrow. And we're going to be doing this to start the hour tomorrow, so have your retake form ready. Even if you have 5 out of 5, you should have a fact or a summary for each of the 4 questions. As always, message me back if you have any questions.